Casio was right. Your love is my drug, and quite frankly, all humans are our drugs in High on Life, the next game from Squanch Games, led by Justin Roiland, the guy that made Rick and Morty, or at least half of it. To cover the basics, High on Life is a colorful first-person shooter with Metroidvania elements, a big emphasis on humor, and of course, the talking arsenal. And that you can play on the Xbox Series consoles as well as PC, and of course on Game Pass. And to preface, as someone who loves Rick and Morty, I've got to say, I was initially pretty let down with the game for reasons that I'll get into, but seeing as how it bears many similarities to my one and only favorite cartoon, but only in game form, I figured it'd almost be a slam dunk, so I figured I had to push through. Don't worry though, there's a lot to like about High on Life, but in this video I have to unfortunately pose the question, High on Life, low on quality? The answer isn't quite as simple as you'd think. So let's break it down into my usual 4 categories. We've got the visuals, audio, gameplay, and the story, or in this case, mostly the comedy. And with that being said, jumping right into the easy 2, let's get right into the visuals. Honestly, I'm inclined to say that the game looks and runs exceptionally well overall, though there are some caveats to that. For instance, the game runs pretty good on an Xbox Series S, and an RTX 3070 PC with very, very little performance issues. Unless for some reason you're looking at a acid waterfall, which for some reason tanks your performance. Another thing on PC, even when installed on an NVMe, the game had to pause in the middle of gameplay to give me a little loading screen to kind of load the world, which felt super outdated, something that I hadn't seen since Morrowind. And to top that off, the level design itself also felt super outdated in a lot of ways as well. Something I'll get into in the gameplay section is that there is a lot of kind of open environment traversal for exploration and different things like that. But for the sake of things, you're going to be looking around a lot of corners and things like that to find things. But by exploring, mostly by going around the corner of the arena where I knew I was supposed to go to, literally just going around the edge of the building, I'd find a lot of dead space that just basically didn't need to be there. It could have been blocked off or simply funneled into the main area where I needed to be, especially if there wasn't going to be a chest or something for me to find back there. Ultimately, it felt like wasted time and wasted space for performance's sake. Another few small issues I had, kind of rapid fire nitpicks for you. The camera, when you're ziplining, it definitely feels like Michael J. Fox is holding the camera here, which it's not that big of a deal, but it definitely feels like the game is a little more janky than it overall needs to be at times. And another thing, I know people hate on Uncharted and more recently the Callisto Protocol for being in your face about kind of the idea that the environment needs to tell you the way forward and all this and that, like the arrows, the indicators, whatever. High on Life has basically none of that in certain points of the game. I won't say in none of the game, that's not true, but there are certain points of the game where there's like 4 or 5 doors that all look identical and 4 of them are locked. One of them will open. They all have the same spinning light on them, and it's not like one light's a different color or anything. Just some differentiation would have been great, and pretty much the only way I would have been able to figure out that proper door would have been by using my scan tool. Something that's really annoying and a nuisance, quite frankly. I guess what I'm trying to say is, let me play the game rather than use the scanner all the time. Also, to anyone who has at least 2 out of 3 of their working eyes, that is a joke, that is a reference to anyone who played the game, haha, you'll see that quite frankly, individual textures in the game don't look that good. Now, don't take this as a complete criticism, as they aren't awful or anything, but they do lack any real depth other than a few assets that do look pretty good. I will say my favorite distinction is that the aliens and their skin all look super slimy, and just by staring at them, you can tell that some of them do definitely sell their cum. But then comes in the color palette and the art style, which is bolstered by a large variety of different life forms and environments and objects to come across. Not that it's quantity over quality by any means, but the eye candy of different biomes and creatures to see, all fitting into the same art style, but being visually distinct, was a happy constant quality throughout the game, and frankly the only environmental letdown for me was the final mission. So I guess you win some, and you lose some. Overall, I'm really in love with the visual style in High on Life, and it carries the game in a lot of ways. Once a performance patch or 2 hits, and maybe a few other of my nitpicks are addressed, I'll be a lot more glowing in this regard. But next up, we have the audio, which to me is a little more cut and dry as mostly pretty high quality, or High on Life quality. Okay, it was bad joke, I'm sorry. So off the bat, you'll note that there's so much voice acting, and that the majority of it is delivered and recorded in a pretty high quality manner. From a character comedically rambling or stumbling over their words to a true heartfelt moment, the voice acting always delivers. On top of that, you've got a nice lo-fi exploration soundtrack that turns a little more techno for the combat, and I do like them both a lot. Though I do have to say that I wish that the switch back to the relaxing music after the combat was a little less jarring and a little more subtle. But really, that's more of a non-issue if you think about it, and once again, another nitpick about the game if you really want to play it that way. Now, there has been a lot of discourse, especially pre-release, about how there's a lot of talking in this game, especially from the guns. And it's important to note that there is a slider to adjust the frequency of the dialogue in this game. Not the main story dialogue, of course, but, the excess dialogue from the guns and things like that. As someone, once again, who is a fan of Rick and Morty, who enjoys that style of comedy, that rambling, that delivery, I think this is just fine as a default. Maybe, if you want to tone it down, you can, but at a default, I think it's just fine. So let it be known that you can tone it down if you still want to play the game. To round out our brief segment on the audio, the only other thing that I can mention are the sound effects. These, of course, are pretty much any other sounds in the game that aren't the voice acting or the soundtrack. So you've got the gunshots or pretty much the footsteps, literally anything else in the game. You've got things like the glob shot, one of the secondary sound effects, and it sounds exactly like the molten goop that it is, and all of the guns sound cool enough. But these sounds alone really don't steal the show by any means. Overall, High on Life strikes me as a high-quality audio experience. The voices and delivery of emotion and quality all are quite good, but the soundtrack has a few mixing issues that I'd like to see addressed. Other than that, if I were in charge of a sequel, I'd just ask for more dialogue and characters, and a lot more soundtrack. Next up, drunk driving at the wheel, we have the gameplay section. I've got to say this game asks the worst thing possible of new players, and that's to be patient for the first, I would say, hour and a half. I'm actually serious the worst part of this game overall is its pacing. Not the story per se, but rather its gameplay. For the first whole section of the game, you're limited to just the pistol, which feels pretty bad in comparison to the other guns, especially when you have no options to switch between. Combining this with the sentiment that High on Life really doesn't have fast or even fun movement, or even bugs where if you're on inclined ground trying to walk forward, you'll be stuck on nothing while fighting and have to jump anyway, and it really just tears up your momentum while you are fighting in those scenarios. It really just seals the game's fate, especially in the early hours, as kind of a drag, at least until new things get introduced, which they thankfully do, and at a pretty good pace once it happens. Then of course there's also the enemies, which unfortunately suffer similar lack in variety early on. While some may visually look distinct early on, and it does kind of drag on a bit as a lot of them are covered in the same armor later, they attack and are handled in the exact same way. Fortunately, as the game goes on, the complexity of your enemies and encounters do ramp up in something that is really quite compelling, in my opinion, especially on higher difficulties. But speaking of compelling, I have to mention the boss fights. There are 7 boss fights in High on Life, and while I won't show them all here today, I gotta stress that each of them teaches you a new trick pretty organically, like how to use the gun to stop a certain attack from a boss, instead of dodging or just trying to wait him out. And this really comes into play as a lot of the boss mechanics build off of one another, even all the way up till the final boss fight, which for me personally led me feeling well prepared going into the final fight, and even super hyped. Plus, one of the bosses is even voiced by SpongeBob, if you can believe that. Now that we've covered the pacing and the enemies, let's talk more about the actual guns themselves and the exploration to close out. As I've already said, the pace in which that you actually get the guns is pretty stunted at first, but eventually it falls into a pretty acceptable cadence, as there are 5 guns overall. Oh, and then there's of course Knifey, a character that I thought would be way more annoying, but honestly ended up hardly talking and only provided like 3 kill animations through the whole game. So I guess, yeah, that actually is pretty annoying if you think about it. I would just like to see more. More kill animations, more environments, more audio tracks. Just a few more things here and there would have made this an easy 100% recommendation for me. But back to it, I would have liked to see a few more guns though. But given that there are 4 really well-voiced guns, with each of them having unique dialogue based on who you're holding and when, as well as a plethora of different upgrades and mods that you can get, I'd say that's a pretty fair trade. The mods can alter things like shooting more ammo at once or even charge shots, which really is helpful for all the guns. You'll have a pistol, an SMG, a shotgun, and a kind of grenade launcher for main functions of guns, and each gun has an alternate fire as well. But most importantly, each of these guns also introduce a Metroidvania style of gameplay, which is also super interesting. For those unfamiliar, this doesn't necessarily mean that the game is 2D like the term's namesake, but rather that the act of progression and exploration of the environment being walled off behind new abilities. And whether it be slowing down time, shooting discs to create new ledges to climb up, or even something like a jetpack, there's a good bit of things to find, especially when being asked to use a combination of these to get around the new areas. Honestly, my biggest criticism here is that whenever I see a molten lava ledge, or a fan or vent or something, I always know exactly what I need to do. Whenever I see something like a fan, I always know to pull out the gun to slow down time to move through the fan. You know, something where I could slow down other objects would be a lot cooler. As I was saying earlier, just more of pretty much everything in the game would go just a little bit further in breaking up the monotony of the gameplay, and to me that would go a lot further in the enjoyment of the minute to minute. And to me, that would go a long way here in making the game more fun outside of just the comedy. Now, outside of just progressing through the level, you'll also be looking around for collectibles and different things like that. And for your keen eye and sharp wit, you'll be rewarded with a chest, and in there you'll either find a collectible, a gun mod, or just some money. Either way, the act of completing these puzzles along with the upgrade motivation makes it a satisfying gameplay loop, even if it does lack the visual flair of being the same chest every time. Now, on the inverse of this, as you're flying around the map and doing different things like that, it is too bad that I have to say that dying in High on Life can be a bit of a pain. In the first full level, I died and all of my platforming puzzles were reset after the checkpoint. And unfortunately, when I died and the checkpoint reset, I was on the opposite side of all of the puzzles. So all of the puzzles reset, but I was on the opposite side. So when I needed to backtrack through and get back to the beginning of the level, I was unable to complete them in the proper way because I'd already done them, but they were already done. So not only did I have to basically really struggle to get back through the level that I'd already completed the correct way, I only had one gun, no traversal mechanics, and quite frankly, no motivation to continue. So once again, really harping on the fact that the early hours of the gameplay really just weren't fun for me whatsoever. Ultimately though, High on Life's gameplay is something that starts off in a near unbearable state. The slog of the opening hours is only offset by the other aspects of the game, but once you make your way through the story and the new guns, enemies, and options are introduced, the game truly starts to breathe. While the shooting and movement never truly feel particularly tight, and I will say that always, it almost kind of finds its place as Doom's little brother who rides a different, shorter bus every day to school with Metroid Prime's little sister. Now with that being said, let's move on to my final category, and that is, of course, the story. And to keep it brief and mostly spoiler-free, you play as a bum piece of shit who has no calling in life, until Earth is invaded by aliens to turn all humans into drugs. Then, once you meet Kenny, the first talking gun or Gatlian, you set out to hunt down the 7 bosses of the intergalactic G3 cartel who is currently harvesting Earth for the humans. The plot is nonsensical both in a good and bad way. Everything feels super convenient most of the time, which both adds to the whimsical tone, but definitely kind of also undercuts any journey the protagonist may find themselves on as well. Now, there is of course a story outside of just taking bounties as a bounty hunter, and there's a lot of heart in High on Life. Whether it be from your sister Lizzie, alien mentor, or even your talking guns, there's a nice message from somewhere. I believe that High on Life's story is set up really well, or at least half of it. But then in the second half, there is a revelation that really needs all of the guns to feel like a family, and quite frankly, up until that point, they just don't. I believe this poor execution up until this point of the setting up of this plot point could make it almost such a great thing, but with a better setup early on with more talking amongst the guns, even when they're not being used, would have been even more ideal, and something that could have made the story of this game even more impactful outside of just the good comedy. Which in turn would have made the game something a little more memorable, something that sits with you a little longer than just, hey, that was a fun experience. And unfortunately, that's where I have to sit that the narrative of High on Life is actually pretty sloppy. As I said, it's pretty whimsical, and it's pretty lighthearted, it's kind of fun. All things considered, it doesn't ask you to take it too seriously, and you really shouldn't, but when it tries to be a little serious, it just doesn't hit for me in the way that it should. So with that being said, let's get to the point where I feel that the game really has the true shine, and that's the comedy. And I have no problem admitting the fact that that's where most of the, narrative of this game actually comes from, as a complete vehicle to just listen to Justin Roiland talk as 30 different voices for 8 hours. Now, getting right into that, I'd describe the comedy of High on Life as more of a shotgun blast. but it will definitely hit everyone in some way. Whether it's some crude fart joke, self-aware pun about video games and their reviewers, or even super existential ramblings of a weird Care Bear creature, there's definitely something there that's gonna get a chuckle out of you at some point. Another thing that I'll give props to is that the game manages to stay really highly curated, while also giving the illusion of choice to the player when necessary. For instance, you come across a bunch of unarmed and pretty angry construction workers that swarm you and refuse to let you pass, and most of the players may see non-enemies and just walk around. But my game devolved into this. Now this is pretty early on, so don't take it as too much of a spoiler.
Can't be called us a Keebler. Are we even brothers anymore? Are we even related anymore? Whoa, hey, tough guy, hey, look, walk wherever you want. This is a fucking Mac and Cheese Brothers construction site. We ain't done here, but you gotta be careful. Whoa, hey, calm down. What the hell? How do you want to handle this? Maybe we just, move past. Are you kidding me? You think you could just walk up into a Mac and Cheese Brothers construction site like you're some sort of fucking Jesus Christ and just fucking walk around like you own the place? There's a goddamn bottomless pit over here, asshole. You think you could survive that? Falling through a fucking bottomless pit down to the bottom? I don't think so. We got work to do. Okay, dipshit? Get the fuck out of here, asshole. Hey, fuck you. You piece of shit. You walk in here, you're pissing me off. Whoa, you just killed my fucking brother, Joey Mac and Cheese Brothers. Holy shit, dude. I don't know if we had to kill him. I'm Jimmy Mac and Cheese, and you killed my brother Joey Mac and Cheese. He was important. I can't believe this. What do we got? You come here and you kill us like an animal? What's wrong with you? Sick character. That's all I can say. Oh my God, this asshole. Are you just gonna kill everyone now? Oh my God, you fucking psychopath. What's your... Well, great. You killed all the weird construction guys. We're free to move along now like we were before we killed them. Hey, sorry, us Mac and Cheese Brothers, we can be a little hot-headed. It's fine if you kill any of them, We're all really loud and annoying, so I get it. Our family has a lot of brothers, so, yeah, it's no real big loss. It's fine.
Of course, once again, as I said, the game never asks you to take it too seriously. There is a lot to see in this game, and as long as you're in the right mood to play it, I believe that this can be a game for you. And once again, there's a lot to see in this game, and with there being 7 different bounties to take, I believe that those are easy sections to split up. Maybe play 1 bounty a night, or even split up those bounties however you like. And the comedy is delivered in a lot of ways. Dialogue from a plethora of aliens, guns, and anything in between make up the most of it, but there's also email pop-ups all over the screen, environmental storytelling, and the occasional collectible, and of course the enemies can twerk on the screen, which is super fucking hot. But truth be told, the game is mostly dumb fun even when it comes to the story. Like the public official who can't officially help you, so his sons come and give you that "my dad works at Nintendo" speech, or even the fact that one of the races of aliens is so used to being a slave that they just get used to it and accept it almost immediately. It's all super entertaining to me as someone who really enjoys the humor here. However, there are a few sad moments in the game too, but in true Marvel tone, that moment is almost immediately undercut with a joke or some kind of one-liner, which is kind of funny in its own way, but that, once again, goes into my fact that the game never asks you to take it too seriously. And as I've brought up all of these examples and try to keep it as brief, but as wide-spanning as possible with some of these descriptions, I look back on High on Life as both entertaining with a little bit of drama, but a lot of comedy. And while I don't think a lot of the story will actually stick with me in the long run, to kind of summarize, High on Life is a good game that suffers in the early hours due to terrible pacing. Thankfully, the game is more similar to wine than drugs in regards to the gameplay, as it only gets better with time. After the first missions, you'll get new guns, enemies, and environments to explore, and that really does help. While the individual textures in the game aren't necessarily amazing at any one point, and you definitely don't want to do the Digital Foundry zoom in, the art style of the game definitely carries, and you are going to get a lot of that Rick and Morty turned into 3D visuals, and it really looks good. And whether your guns are talking or shooting, the audio is all pretty fine, except when you have a few soundtrack mixing issues. And fine is just the word that I would use for the story and the narrative as well. However, I do believe that the writing when it comes to the comedy and the humor of the game really does shine above the rest. And in that regard, I can definitely say to fans of the genre and to fans of Justin Roiland's work, from his signature ramblings, the Marvel one-liners, the toilet humor, and pretty much the complete package, you will not be disappointed. And quite frankly, given the playtime of about 9 hours for the main story, and then about 13 to 14 hours for a lot of the extra stuff, in my experience, I would recommend paying about $40 to $45 for this game. But anyways, guys, that's it for me on my High on Life review. I kind of took my time with this one. This won't be the first review that I've put out this year, but it's definitely going to be the first review that I've recorded for this year. So, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I guess I'm excited for 2023 and what that brings. Coming up on 1,000 subscribers, so consider subscribing if you made it this far. And, yeah, thanks for watching. Goodbye.